Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Before we get started with our speakers, I want to go over a few housekeeping rules. So you will see that we have a chat box. Here you're able to talk with everyone who's viewing. Go ahead and drop where you're tuning in from or your LinkedIn. We also have a questions box where you can put in questions that our speakers will be answering at the end. And you also will see that we have reactions. And so you can react to what our amazing speakers are going to be sharing. So now I will hand it on over to Craig and Alan, who will be sharing what the future of B2B marketing is.
Okay. Hi, my name is Craig Charney, and I'm the research director of AMA New York, and was the lead figure on the research that you're going to see presented. And my co-panelist is Alan Hart. Now, Alan is the creator and host of Marketing Today with Alan Hart, a weekly podcast where he interviews leading global marketing professionals and business leaders. He's a senior manager at Deloitte Consulting, where Alan advises leading executives and marketing teams on brand, customer experience, innovation, and growth opportunities. He's consulted with Fortune 100 companies, but he's an entrepreneur at his core, having founded or served as an executive for 9 companies, all but one in B2B. In my own case, I've been the head, in addition to being on the AMA board for about 10 years now. I'm the head of Charney Research, which is a boutique market research and polling agency in New York City, which focuses on global markets, high tech, and healthcare sectors. We've been involved with the Future of Marketing study for the AMA New York for several years now. The first iteration was in 2019, and we came back to it to see how things have changed. In our first version, we only looked at consumers and people who were marketing to them. But there was someone named Michelle Chiantera, who was now the head of AMA New York and is CMO at Corel and was previously CMO at Cisco Systems. And she said, Craig, why aren't you doing anything about B2B? So I scratched my head and said, because we forgot to. So this time around, in the second iteration of the survey, we're taking a look not just at B2C, which we did in the first two segments and webinars, both of which were covered previously and both of which are available on the AMA website. But today we'll be talking about the new B2B and how it is omnichannel, tech-friendly, and woke. And we may well see Michelle joining us shortly. I can see her working with the techies to try to get onto the panel. But what we're doing now is looking at a few slides, which will give you some sense of what the results of this survey were. Then we'll talk about them. We'll also respond to your questions. Then we'll have a more wide-ranging discussion of B2B, what the findings are, and how these actually would change your implementation of B2B marketing. And for that, we hope there'll be as much audience participation as possible. So without further ado, let's take a look at what we found. What we did, by the way, was survey about 400 American consumers, 400 marketers, and about 300 B2B purchasers. And so this survey is going to present most of the results of B2B purchasing and those of the marketers selling to B2B. So first of all, who is this market? We took a look at the composition of the B2B buying market by age and by gender. If you look at age, there's a very simple conclusion. Millennials rule. 59% of the buyers are between 26 and 40. The next largest group is a bit older, 41 to 55. They're 30%. At the bottom and top end of the age scale, relatively few. 18 to 25, 6%. 56 plus, 5%. So it's mostly a millennial game. What about gender? Well, it's still 60% male, 40% female. And what you see here is that the B2B buyer of today looks pretty much like they've usually looked, namely middle-aged and male. But what happens if we take a closer look? What we see in particular is that gender changes a lot, both by age and by the size of purchases. In particular, you see here that the majority of younger B2B buyers, those who are under 30 years old, are women, 53%. On the other hand, those who are a little older, 31 to 40, are more than 2 to 1 male. Same is true for the 41 to 50. And interestingly enough, the relatively small group that are 50 plus also say that the majority of them are female. We also see a revealing pattern by purchase size. In particular, women handle 60% of the smaller purchases, those that are less than $1,000. On the other hand, larger categories of B2B purchasing, 1 to 10K, 10 to 100K, or 100K plus, are largely male. The last category, the biggest in particular, still being 3 to 1 male. Now, we do see some differences by sector. Women make up a majority of the purchasers in retail and in consumer non-durables. And we see that they are close to parity and will probably take over the majority in the consumer services sector within the next decade. So if we look 10 years ahead and look at these demographics, what we see is a world in which women are probably going to be the majority of purchasers. But for the moment, it's men who are in charge, and particularly for the largest purchases. Now, let's go from the who's doing the buying to how they're buying. And in this table, you see 3 categories. One is all B2B buyers. The second is those who are making purchases under $1,000, and those who are at the biggest end of the scale, those who are making 100K plus. Now, the most important finding is that the company website is more important than stores. And that is true, interestingly enough, for smaller buys as well as bigger ones. What we see for the smaller buys is that company websites tie stores. For bigger purchasers, company website leads. If it seems paradoxical that those who make very large purchases are also buying from stores, that is probably because they too make smaller purchases as well. But what we see is that the bigger purchases also involve more means of information and more means of purchase, more purchase channels. Thus, the company mobile app is also used by bigger purchasers, stores of mobile payments, third-party websites, service centers, personal meetings, and so forth. And in fact, one of the interesting points we see here is the way B2B marketing is changing. What we're seeing is that the kinds of sales that involve direct personal contact, whether it's a store or a service center or meetings with sales reps or telephone marketing, all of these are waning for small purchases. And indeed, they're starting to wane for larger purchases too. On the other hand, for big buys, the personal touch is still important. We have more purchase channels are used and more ways of contacting the seller. So personal still matters for the big things. Boris Schifrin asks if we have a breakdown by industry. Yes, and what these largely follow on is the nature of sectors. Thus, in producer goods, for example, there is much more use of the more individual and personalized sales mechanisms, and that's because these purchase channels also generally involve much bigger buys. Now, let's take a look at media use, both total media use and social media use specifically. What we see here is that for B2B buyers, time spent online with websites is equal to that for streaming TV and radio, followed by social media, online games, online email, broadcast TV, and outdoors. And what's interesting is every single one of these media takes roughly 10 to 12% or 9 to 12% of the buyer's time. So there's no single medium that predominates. What is worth noting is that broadcast TV is a much smaller share of their media time than is the case for the general public. These other figures are relatively close, but for the general public, almost 20%, namely almost 1 in 5 or 18% is spent on linear TV. That's much less true now. And indeed, total online information sources get a little bit more of the B2B buyer's time, 52%, compared to traditional media, which claimed 45%. Now, if we look specifically at social media, what do we see? Um, well, it looks a lot like the consumer profile. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram are all the top social media, followed by Twitter and TikTok. And you would see much the same for consumer profiles. What is different is that Twitter and LinkedIn, which take about 1/5 of the social media time of B2B buyers, are significantly greater than the share that the average consumer dedicates to it. That makes sense because both of these networks, LinkedIn and Twitter, tend to be more professionally and publicly oriented, whereas the others are more focused on personal experience. It is interesting to note, though, that even in the B2B buying world, TikTok is getting a significant share of social media use. That reflects largely younger buyers, but it is interesting as a source of exposure. So we see overall that media use is increasingly moving towards the digital side and the on-demand side. Social media in particular are similar to consumers, but the roles of LinkedIn and Twitter, the professional networks, is greater. The pattern that we're starting to see here, in fact, is something that you'll see in other results of the study, namely that B2B buyers are people too. And what this means in particular is that in terms of their media use, their decision making, their other preferences regarding the purchase process, in many respects, B2B buying now, although it involves more people, often is a very similar process to the purchase process for consumer goods. Now here, excuse me, here we look more specifically at the information sources that are used in B2B purchasing. And advertising still remains very important. As you can see, the two top sources are online or print ads and seller websites and reviews, which you saw earlier are very important. After that come live promotional events, conferences, and hybrid events. And as I mentioned earlier, these sorts of things are more important for bigger purchases rather than smaller ones. And of course, webinars like the one you're on now are also important. They are used for more than 35%. The last two white papers and third-party reviews or articles are relatively small, 27% and 19% respectively. However, they loom larger, once again, if you're talking about large-scale purchases, particularly the purchases over $100,000. So online, but the personal role is still important for the big purchases. Now, moving from the different media that access B2B purchasers, here we're taking a look at how they react to MarTech itself. And what we're doing is comparing the responses of B2B purchasers in the black lines to consumers in the blue lines. And one thing obviously jumps out from this chart. B2B buyers like MarTech. In fact, they're much more comfortable with it than the average consumer. Consumers have become much more positive towards MarTech in the period and after the period of the height of the pandemic. This is something that's discussed in some detail in our first report. Did COVID kill the techlash? But what we can see here is that there's a much higher acceptance among the B2B purchasing cohort. Thus, we see the highest acceptance is AI assistance and the collection of Internet of Things data, followed by virtual reality, smart speakers, personalized ads, augmented reality, dream ad tech. This is where ads are played before you go to sleep, omni-channel, or micro-influencers. And these numbers are phenomenal, ranging from 79% at the low end to 92% or almost 9 in 10 at the high end. These are not the sort of figures you usually see in market research, and indeed, they're considerably higher than the figures for consumers who have a lot more hesitancy about marketing technologies. But when it comes to the world of the B2B buyer, their view towards MarTech is full speed ahead. Why? Well, they see very important advantages of MarTech, and once again, they see them much more sharply than consumers do. Here we see the black bars once again being B2B buyers, the blue bars the consumer. And here we see virtually 90% on every single positive, thus better public services. Shopping is more informative. Internet of Things devices make my life easier. Purchasing is easier. Brands understand my needs better. Um, Shopping becomes more enjoyable and fun, and it's quicker too. So here, overwhelmingly, B2B buyers are sold on MarTech. If you're thinking of selling to them, all of you can use the various sorts of innovative marketing technologies, and you're not likely to get the kind of pushback that is a risk with consumers. On the other hand, this is not because the B2B buyers are blind to the problems of MarTech. Not at all. Here again, black is B2B buyer, blue is consumer. And what we see is that the concerns about marketing technology on their part match those of consumers. Thus, 3 and 4 are concerned about fake accounts, false information, and hackers. Isolation and depression concerns 7 and 10. Same is true for the feeling of being under constant surveillance from MarTech. The fear that purchasing will lose the human touch gets similar numbers. Fear of loss of privacy is also mentioned by 7 and 10. And slightly fewer, about 55%, are worried that advertising will become less creative, less interesting, and less fun as MarTech steps up. So what this means is that although the B2B purchasers are open to technology, you still have to be concerned about the kinds of issues that could get at them. Privacy breaches in particular, the sense that they're being under surveillance, the creep factor of contacting people too often in the wrong ways or at the wrong times, and especially the concern about breaches, false information, people spoofing your brand, or the like. These are things that are concerns for B2B purchasers just as they are for consumers. A brand that does poorly in these areas can find that there's a lot of pushback. Still, where is B2B marketing headed? Well, we asked people in the field themselves what they thought about it, and here's what they told us. 56% say it's going to be all or mostly digital and online. And another third say it's going to be mostly online for marketing and advertising, but a mix of shopping and purchasing online and offline. And we found that the people who don't expect much change are far fewer. Only 10% say it will be much like today, 2% say it's mostly offline, 2% are not sure. But if you add all of these together, you get a massive majority, 88%, who see marketing as mostly online, although shopping and purchasing reaches something of a divide, with a third saying it will be omni-channel, and many saying it, about half saying it will be mostly online. So the digital transformation is clearly expected. Now, one thing that's a very important conversation regarding marketers is the whole question of purpose and whether and how much brands should express their purpose. So we asked B2B purchasers, just as we'd asked consumers, what are the issues companies should be most concerned with? And once again, what we found was there was remarkable similarity in the expectations. In fact, the top issues were exactly the same. 34% of each group said that companies should strive to be good employers. Around 1 in 4 said good corporate citizenship, giving back to the communities you operate in. A similar proportion, slightly fewer, said sustainability and the environment should be very important. And likewise, racial equality is another area that people see both in the B2B world and in the consumer world in general as an issue companies should address. Interestingly enough, B2B buyers are considerably more sensitive to the question of workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. For them, that ties racial equality in the society more generally, whereas it's mentioned by only 15% of people in the general consumer group. Interestingly enough, protecting voting rights and democracy then comes next for both consumers and the B2B groups. And likewise, we see similar proportions, if smaller, reflected in corporate support for women's rights, criminal justice reform, and lesbian, gay, and others related issues. So again, what really comes through is how the preferences of consumers regarding corporate purpose are important, but so are the preferences of B2B buyers, and they're not very different. Now, a question that one has to ask from a marketing standpoint is, what difference does it make? In particular, what difference is there in terms of purchase intentions if a company does well on purpose? Well, what we see here is that it actually has more of an impact on B2B buyers than it does on consumers. Once again, the darker bars are B2B, the blue bars are consumers. What we see is that a total of 72% of B2B buyers say they're more likely to buy from companies doing well on purpose, compared to just 55% of consumers. A finding that is particularly striking to me as a pollster is that the top box is the big box, that 48% of B2B buyers and just 29% of consumers say they are much more likely to buy from a company that does well. So in other words, we're not dealing with something that's very mild. We're dealing with something that actually reflects strong feelings and strong decision-making factors. Here we see some breakdowns in terms of the impact of brand purpose on purchasing by purchase size on the left and by economic sector on the right. Here, what we see is the proportion who say only they are much more likely, the top box group. And what we see is, interestingly enough, that the proportion who say they're much more likely rises substantially with the biggest purchases. 35% of those whose buys are under 10K, more than half of those whose buys are between 10 and 100K, and fully 62% of those whose purchases are $100,000 or more. Now, this may reflect the fact that when you have a bigger budget, you also have more discretion and can absorb a slightly higher cost for purpose. But what is very striking is that the question of purpose is very much a matter that is alive in B2B purchasing and at every level of scale. We also see interesting differences between sectors. In particular, the proportion who say that they are likely to make purchasing decisions on purpose is much more likely among producer goods and consumer durables. Now, these are also sectors where the purchasing tends to be largest. But it's very important to note that, these are purchasers who are in consumer goods and consumer durable sectors. So they're often buying machinery, raw materials in bulk, or the like. Then the groups that are in between, where just under half say that they're much more likely to buy from companies with purchase, include retailers, consumer services, and business services. The smallest proportion who said that purpose would matter were those who are in the area of consumer non-durables. These are what they produce, not what they buy. So even in the smallest group, however, nearly 3 in 10 say they're much more likely to buy from brands achieving on purpose. So what we see is that in areas that we wouldn't normally think of it, producer goods and consumer durables, purpose is particularly important, but it runs through all the economic sectors as a factor in B2B buying. Now here we compare again B2B buyers to consumers. The top bar is the B2B and the second bar is the consumers. And here we're asking, are you actually willing to pay more for purpose-driven companies and their products? And what we see is that the response from the purchasers is yes. In particular, 35% of the B2B buyers are willing to pay up to 10% more compared to 25% of the consumers. 21% of business buyers and 13% consumers are willing to pay 11 to 24% more. And 17% of B2B buyers, compared to just 10% of consumers are willing to pay 20 to 50% more. And what we're seeing in contrast is that the proportion who refuse to pay more is 41% among consumers, but only 24% among B2B buyers. In other words, 3/4 of B2B buyers say they are willing to to pay more for goods and services that are coming from purpose-driven companies. I see, by the way, Boris Shafran has commented that those trends are likely affected by sustainability programs, which are sweeping through industry, driven by European ESG initiatives. I think that's right. And Boris, I go further. They're also being driven by ESG investors in this country, people who are looking for green bonds and green stocks, and people who are, as well as people who are looking for green products and services. But there's a very strong trend. I think people have not realized just how strong a lot of these tendencies are. So let me sum up the conclusions of the survey. And then we'll have a reaction from Alan, and then from yourselves as well. So here are the 4 questions we tried to address. Who are the B2B buyers? Well, like I said, it's millennial guys now, principally, especially in the biggest buys and the biggest firms. 10 years from now, though, it's going to be predominantly women. Especially, they will dominate the small and middle-sized firms and in the sectors of retail, consumer non-durables, and consumer services. When it comes to the question of how to reach them, well, websites are your most important channel. Stores are already out for about half the B2B buyers. But for big buys, personal contact still matters. Events with sellers, meetings with sales reps, white papers, reviews, that sort of thing. And the media choices are much like those of consumers, but the B2B buyer sees less linear video and spends more time on Twitter and LinkedIn, about twice as much time as the average consumer. How can MarTech be used by yourselves? Well, customers in the B2B market are very comfortable with MarTech, but you have to be aware of its negatives. You still have to look out for the creep factor, for invasion of privacy and the like. And something that I should mention that we didn't get to in the charts is that people who are working from home are particularly worried about the security of their digital activities. Their homes, after all, tend to have less elaborate digital protections and firewalls than companies do. So this is something to be alert to as well. Finally, does purpose matter? Stereotypically, many people might have thought no, but B2B buyers actually have very similar expectations to the average consumer. They want fairness in employment. They want help to communities. They want environmental and racial justice. And they also want DEI even more than the average consumer does. And overall, in terms of willingness to buy, purpose matters more to B2B buyers than it does to the average consumer. And products that are doing well on purpose can also charge premium prices, which is also an interesting and practical application. So let me stop there and say, Alan, do you have comments, questions, or reactions? Anything that surprised you?
Thank you. Yeah, I was exceptionally surprised by how male dominated the demographics were. And maybe I'm skewed. I'm selling mostly into the marketing space and into corporate clients, and they tend to. I want to say the stat that I've seen recently is 60% of those are female buyers at that level. But so that surprised me. But that's probably just where I'm focused versus the market overall. The second part that surprised me, but there's some research that I've done outside of this that I think would tend to validate it, is the drive around purpose, ESG, and diversity inclusion efforts, and the appetite, I guess, or the desire for companies that they buy from to have those things integrated into their products. I had done some consumer research late last year, and saw an interesting trend related to income levels, which may relate to the size of the size of the purchases as well, and the fact that purpose, or the desire for purpose-driven businesses to buy from, increases as the price point, I guess, increases, maybe driven by incomes of people. It seemed like purpose from a consumer standpoint was more important for those people with higher discretionary incomes than those with lower discretionary incomes. I think that makes sense, right? If you're looking for more value potentially, and maybe not willing to pay a little premium to buy something that costs a little bit more for other reasons, whatever that is. So those were two that stood out. The other one was LinkedIn, and the lack of LinkedIn, as when I think about it being the B2B social network, and yet YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram all outweighed it in terms of content people were using the day before. Now, maybe that makes sense. LinkedIn, in my personal feed, the number of connections I get from sales reps today probably outweigh real people that I would want to connect with otherwise by probably a factor of 5 or 10 to 1. So maybe we're driving them away from LinkedIn and the platform. So anyway, those were a few of the reactions I had as I was looking at the data. Very interesting though.
Yeah, well, on that last point, I mean, I guess partly it depends on what people are looking for. I mean, for example, in my own personal YouTube feed, I tend to look for music or people I enjoy listening to. And I don't know if this experience is common, but when I see people who are working in the marketing space buying video ads on LinkedIn, I tend to feel like that's an intrusion. Whereas, buying video ads on YouTube, I tend to experience that as an intrusion, because YouTube is where I go to for music and speakers I like and so forth. Whereas in LinkedIn, on the other hand, I don't find ads intrusive at all. That seems it always strikes me an appropriate venue for them. I wonder if you have a similar reaction. And from this standpoint, the fact that people in B2B spend twice as much time on LinkedIn or Twitter as do people in the consumer space does seem to me actually a reflection of the recognition of those media for B2B.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the other thing I might caveat is that the ads that show up on YouTube when I'm in my consumer space, right, and I'm watching a video just for fun, I am definitely thrown off when it's a business-oriented ad. But I have seen, I think, an emergence of B2B marketers developing content that is much more consumer-like, marketing to me as an individual, as a person, versus marketing to me as a business buyer. And those don't have the same jarring effect as I'm watching whatever I'm trying to watch for fun.
Yes, I think that's right. What did you think of the findings about the importance of the personal touch getting bigger the bigger the purchase?
I think it makes sense to some degree. The reason I would say is the risk for the buyer goes up as the price point goes up, right? And I think us as humans, it's always nice to put a face with where my money's going, or said another way, a throat that I can choke if it goes badly. And so I think that's probably a sign of like, are the digital channels a good proxy for building trust, or do we have to still have the personal touch to take us over the edge when trust really matters?
Yes, I thought that was interesting. And the flip side of the personal touch in big buys is the fact that we're seeing, I think, again, as in consumer marketing, a fairly dramatic waning of the role of stores in the smaller purchasing. Were you struck by that as well?
Yes. Yeah, it was. The whole data set that you have here is very interesting, though. I could spend hours with it, I think.
Well, with B2B being more modern in the buying process and more digital, while still appreciating high touch marketing, does that mean that account-based marketing is the answer? Focus on, the individuals in the company and zooming in on those things?
Honestly, I think it depends on what you're selling, right? Within the B2B space. Account-based selling works, I think, well when it's a complex purchase. I should say it works well, I believe, in many different scenarios. But when it's a complex purchase, then you're trying to influence along the way many different stakeholders. I think it can work really well. When those buyers are harder to reach, I think it also helps with that aspect. But if we're at a low price point and it's a relatively transactional, nominal purchase that can be expensed, account-based marketing seems like overkill at that point. Other than the fact that you're trying to drive further penetration or more users to re-up on the same subscription type offering, maybe then. But I would just call that further account penetration marketing versus true account-based marketing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we wouldn't use ABM to sell staplers or something like that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Or notebooks. Yeah.
Yes. But on the other hand, if you're talking about selling an aircraft or even a large commercial vehicle or something like that,
right.
And I guess it also reflects the fact that the decision-making process has also become more diverse in the sense that at the bottom end, in a way, it's becoming, if it won't become automated with the Internet of Things, at the very least, it's becoming very much a digital process. Whereas as companies become bigger and more bureaucratic and as buys become bigger and bigger as well, in the sense that the purchasing the materials for a gigafactory or the like are enormous. And as the decision making becomes larger and more bureaucratized, I guess that helps play in. It is why it becomes more necessary to address human beings through ABM and a human factor in terms of the way a company relates to them.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there is a place, and we saw a little bit of this in terms of the MarTech piece that you talked about, and I think I've seen very well with a lot of, frankly, MarTech providers in some cases using chatbots online to help me, path find my way, which is totally a replacement for a human conversation, and as well as collect those signals on what my buying behavior is. I'm sure they're also tracking my business IP address and understanding where I'm coming from and which company, which could help supplement any ABM, marketing efforts that they're doing as well. But I think that, as we get more sophisticated with those types of things, I think we could push up into the price point areas where you could reduce human involvement. But I think the more complexity and the higher the ticket item, I find it will probably be hard to eliminate the personal touch. And I know I'm coming from the consulting world. I don't see anyone buying consulting services not talking to a human. That's basically the delivery of the services itself are the humans. So that would be. I can't even imagine a world right now where that might happen.
Yeah, and in fact, that's an interesting distinction between services, which are increasingly dominating the economy, as opposed to manufacturing or the primary sector as well. Because services, although portions of them are increasingly automated, particularly back office type functions, the nature of the relationship is a very personal one. If you're talking to an accountant, a lawyer, a doctor, or the like, whether it's relatively small scale or relatively large one, let alone a marketer, trust matters a great deal. And that's where the question of building that sort of relationship and establishing the human factor, or at least establishing confidence that humans are involved, is going to be important.
Yeah, I think I would add on to that. I agree with everything you said. I would add on that any place where expertise or demonstration of expertise is needed beyond what can be shown in a written form, I think it accentuates the need for that personal touch as well. That could be in a scientific field. It could be, in a field like semiconductors or somewhere that's more complicated and nuanced. It doesn't have to just be professional services. It could be selling chips at the end of the day, but it's embedded in a solution that needs to be technically superior and have that technical experience demonstrated. Yes.
By the way, Alan and I will keep chatting, but we'd like to welcome some questions and feedback from people in the audience. Eugene Barlos has been mentioning some interesting things about the question of purpose. He noted that one of our clients is a plant-based food delivery service who gets a 35% premium for things they say are healthy. And he also mentioned that he found the LinkedIn side interesting, but much of the B2B is much higher there than any of the others. But then our buyers are 40 plus business founders who don't have time for many other platforms. Mm-hmm. Yes, I suspect Eugene's customers aren't spending much time on TikTok. But if there are those of you who have more comments or more questions, please put them on, particularly questions which we'll try to address. In the meanwhile, turning to the whole question of purpose, people talk about purpose as the company's relationship to the outside world, and culture, on the other hand, as the relationship of companies to the inside world. But Alan, do you think there are ways companies can implement that involves both purpose and culture on the inside and the outside? And are you aware of any examples of that?
Culture on the inside and the outside. Yeah, I think so. I actually was just interviewing the CMO from AMD this week. It'll be a future podcast release. But I think they have an interesting brand platform, but it's being leveraged in many different contexts. And I think it's potentially a good example, which is the brand platform or catchphrase, if you will, is "Together we advance." And this came about, actually was developed before their acquisition of another large competitor, Xilinx. And so they were about to go to market and the acquisition came about. They paused everything to make sure that Xilinx was on board with this. And if you think about it, the coming together of two companies to advance the semiconductor industry is kind of an interesting way to talk about "Together we advance." But they're also driving a lot of DEI initiatives internally. Again, "Together we advance," I think can work in many different ways, both from a go-to-market perspective, as well as an internal rallying cry for the merger and the coming together of two different companies, as well as the diversity of the employee base that they have in general. Now you take that a step further, and I think even their go-to-market pathways make a lot of sense to use a platform like "Together we advance" as well, because they're largely working and in many cases funding marketing activities for their partners, a Dell, a Lenovo, et cetera, those things that have the AMD chips embedded in them. So that's one example, I think, where you can pull that thread all the way through. If it lights up your employees and it's important to them, it's likely going to light up and be important to your buyers as well. And that's what your research is showing, I believe, as well. So I think looking for that thread from a marketer standpoint, it makes perfect sense because it's so much more efficient to have one platform to work from. Yes. And it unifies all of the messaging that we work on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I see Eugene has asked a good question, which is simply, I'm curious how you sampled. So let's respond to that. We took two groups, for the marketers and for the B2B buyers. We worked with Tuluna, and they deserve a shout out, in fact, for really doing a very good job with us on this, as well as our partners at Greenbook, who helped tabulate the data and have been kind enough to post this webinar. So we asked for basically a broad reach across sectors, across regions, and across company sizes, for both the marketers and the purchasers. And the result was that we had a good mix in all of them, and we were able to actually split them into a variety of sectors, and look at the various other ways that we could slice and dice the population. And that ended up proving very interesting. One thing we didn't do and should have done was ask the race or ethnic identity of the buyers, because just as it was very interesting to see the changes in terms of the composition of the gender composition of the buyer population, I think we should have, and next time will, look at the question of racial inclusion as well. That's something we missed out on this time.
It looks like there's a question in the questions portion of the chat feature from Myra. And Myra says, the social political findings are really interesting, but I do wonder how that falls on partisan lines. Our sales team is concerned about the backlash against ESG efforts, and she's asking for thoughts. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Craig.
I do, but why don't you start off?
Well, I think it's definitely an interesting question, and we do live in a hyper polarized world today. I do think there are things that are possible that are what I would call in the messy middle, right? Like I think it's a personal belief. Haven't seen data on this, but I believe that vast majorities of our country as well as the world are probably in that messy middle, not on the fringes that we hear so much about every day and see in our social feeds. And so I think if you can find the issues that may not be the fringe issues to focus on or causes, but are in that middle range, you can still make quite a big impact. And at the end of the day, we're all human, and I think if we can stand up for human rights, whether that or human independence, whatever the type of thing is that we're wanting to focus on. I think those are totally fair game. One important caveat, though, I think, is it has to be authentic to the company. Meaning, it has to be based in the company's corporate values, the DNA of the company, if there's no values around to look to. Because if it doesn't, it's going to come off the wrong way. And it's not going to be able to be delivered by your sales force, if you have one and they're in disagreement with where you're at. So I think alignment with corporate values and maybe trying to focus on the messy middle where most of the population is, it would be a good place to start.
Yes. And I mean, from a polling standpoint, I mean, the question of the pushback against purpose is a very interesting one. And in fact, in the 2023 Future of Marketing study, yes, there will be one. We'll be looking at that, among other things. But I think there's some things we can say based on what we know from this and other studies as well. One is that there are a lot of things that are fairly strong consensus items, that are 2/3 or 80% feel a given way, and those are reasonably safe. And there are more of those than you would think. For example, fair employment for gay and lesbian employees is something that's actually fairly consensual in our society now. On the other hand, there are some things that may be more controversial and maybe more sensitive, and there you may need to be more concerned. However, it's important there to understand who you're actually focusing on and who your market is. And the outstanding example of this is Colin Kaepernick and Nike. After Colin Kaepernick took a knee and became the subject of some controversy, there were worries among Nike investors that the company would not do as well. There are highly publicized incidents, although perhaps they were a bit fringe, for people burning shoes and the like, and the share price dropped. However, the interesting thing is that Nike knew who bought its shoes, young men, particularly young Black men, and they really liked Colin Kaepernick. So as a result, their sales went up, and of course, their share price recovered. So, Myra, knowing who you're talking to is just as important as knowing what you're saying. This is where it's actually worth doing research, and I suspect Nike did this, to see if your customers are the ones who are going to be put off by this. I think, it is a risk, particularly since organized pushback is happening in certain states and certain localities against things like environmental policies. However, I think it may be less of a risk than people tend to think it is. If there are more questions, Myra's question was a very good one, by the way. If more people have other questions like that, please do put them in the question box or the chat box, and we'll try to answer them.
Yeah, I'll add one plug for Myra if you're interested. There's a book, I just put it in the chat, called Marketing Era in the Era of #Fake News, by a friend of mine, Peter Horst. He former CMO, multi-time over, and CEO of a market research company more recently, but retired.
Tell us more about the book.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book. The most important piece of it to me has been this framework that he has in terms of when is it appropriate to go out on a limb and stand for and get behind a specific position or issue, etc. And he has a really nice way of diagramming that out, and some of the examples he gives are also equally good. At the top end of the spectrum, is Patagonia, of course, and even with their most recent announcement of making the planet their number one shareholder, I think it takes it to a whole nother level that he didn't anticipate in the book. But he also talks about other companies. A company that I worked for not too long ago was Capital One, and they would probably never go out and make a stance on a political, a pure political issue, but they do have core values, and they do focus on those human components that we were talking about in the middle. And so diversity, inclusion efforts are highly important. Diversity within tech and bringing more diverse folks into the tech community, it was a big push for them as well. And so he talks about kind of using this framework to determine kind of where you are and where is the the space in which your company can play. There's another portion of the book, which is also, I think, equally important if you're going to push into this space, which is like, how do you actually make the case, and what are the boardroom conversations that happen around these types of things when you want to push forward with them? So highly recommend it, if nothing else for the framework that he uses. But
now, another question that strikes me from the implication of these findings is, if purpose matters, how should companies tell B2B marketers about them? I mean, we asked, how would you accept this news? And B2B customers, more than consumers, are willing to believe in things like ESG reports or company releases. But if you're asked if your company is doing well in a particular field or making a real effort in a particular field, it sounds like we want our B2B customers to know about it. How should they be told?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the natural tendency kind of overlaps a little bit with what you're saying, is like to write a report and issue a accountability report on whatever the topic is, diversity or climate impact. But it's less integrated into the marketing in that regard. I think where it overlaps, I'll go back to AMD. The conversation's fresh because it was this week, but they are, as you can think of it, chips and computing power. It's a hot issue right now, literally hot issue, because it's eating energy, it's creating heat, it's hard to cool, it's energy intensive, and so one of the areas that they're focused on is like their climate impact. And focusing on how do we actually advance the technology to a place where it's taking less energy, and having less climate impact in the long term. I think that's an issue where you can actually work the message into your marketing itself, and your value proposition of why you versus the other guy. But not every issue is like that. And so, you have to try to find what the right balance is. I think there are other issues that are probably even more important to the employee base, and keeping an employee base heavily engaged and driving a good culture, which in many respects I think is starting to become a marketing job. So maybe some issues are left for internal and reporting for transparency purposes, but finding those core issues that can go right through your product value proposition make a lot of sense too.
Yeah. One other thing, Myra has just commented, social media is an easy way to message about purpose over time. Mm-hmm. One of the things that occurs to me, for example, is that it's probably less problematic, for example, to include things in YouTube and Facebook feeds that relate more to purpose or to kind of the softer, more social side. That's probably, if it's engaging and interesting, less likely to be a turnoff than the kind of hard sell, here's what you need to market, or right. The ads dealing with that I've received dealing with people promoting certain marketing research platforms, which I don't really want to hear about after I've just been listening to Emerson Lake and Palmer.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's a great call out, Myra, that social media can be a good play. The other thing to think about is two other companies that come to mind is one is Salesforce, and they have huge amounts of charitable philanthropy focus. Even the Salesforce nonprofit arm, I can't even remember what it's called, it's the charitable arm. That's one way. I mean, and earned media in terms of the press that you're getting around those types of events is one way. It's still an exposure at the end of the day.
Very much.
And then another one that comes to mind that may be more woven into the fabric would be like NI, which used to be National Instruments, but they're doing a big push around profiling technology, inventors, technologists, scientists, as it relates to how do we bring more diverse talent to the nature of technology and engineering, and picking the people that you're profiling. Yes, they're your customers. Yes, they probably are going to provide a case study or a solution overview, but they can also tell a story about who they are as human beings and what makes them unique and special. And so that might be also like a human touch on an existing, case study type approach.
Yes. Now, one other thing, a question I want to ask you, because you will know more about this than I do. I'm just a market researcher. And also maybe some of our audience knows about is this: how is purpose actually integrated into B2B purchase decisions, particularly the bigger ones? Is it one of the factors on a checklist that a committee does? Is there going to be a purpose person whose job it is to advocate? How do you see this happening? I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about it, Alan, and anybody in the audience who wants to address it too.
Yeah, I think I would love to hear from the audience on this topic, because my set of experience is pretty limited. But I think there are certain companies today that have an ESG mandate, and they might even be, seen as a investment vehicle for ESG. Those companies, it's going to show up on the RFP checklist. It's because they've got to be able to show that capability and that focus throughout, such that they don't pervert the opportunity to have investment for people that are focused on those types of investments. So I think in that case, it's going to show up in the evaluation criteria. On the where that's not the case, I think it's still, at the end of the day, we're marketing to human beings, and you have to focus on what's important to them. And yes, it may not be on the official checklist, but they're probably thinking about it. And especially if you are known to not have a good reputation in a certain area, it's even worse. But I think it could be an opportunity for those that do to stand out from the rest.
Yeah, and Eugene's just made a very interesting comment. He said, at First Steps Capital and our portfolio companies, we prioritize women-owned companies, sustainable products, and climate awareness. We also confirmed that they would never divest any products from the state of Israel. The last one is an absolute deal breaker, so no Ben and Jerry's, I guess. I think this is an interesting question, because one of the things that's happened from a marketing and market research standpoint is that increasingly we're trying to look at decision makers. That's also involved in marketing and things like account-based management. We're actually trying to find out, well, who are the folks who make the decisions. So I think this whole question as to how we integrate information about this into the processes, both the formal processes of decision making about purchasing and the informal awareness building, the process that helps shape impressions of companies and their products and the like, is very important. The one thing we haven't mentioned, though, that is the caveat that's always necessary, is you have to avoid whitewashing, greenwashing, or any other kind of washing. It is catastrophic. I mean, BP is suffering from beyond petroleum even now. Volkswagen will be suffering for years from its emissions frauds. I mean, that was why when they launched Volkswagen as an April Fool's joke, nobody got it. And your claims have got to be right. Otherwise, there is a tremendous risk of a pushback that's going to be devastating.
Yes. I hope we get to a place quickly where we just don't do that stuff anymore, right? Like, that makes no sense. It makes no sense.
But there's a lot of consumer suspicion out there, and we recently were doing research where Asian consumers were looking at an Asian product, and even though it said made in Vietnam, one of them said, "I'm very suspicious. I think it's just a white company that's putting that label on there."
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I think there's equal criticism for the folks that show up for specific, Black History Month or Pride Week, and then don't carry that forward throughout the rest of the year. A lot of friends of mine, they're African Americans, they're African Americans every day. Just because it's this month doesn't mean it's changed my experience. And I think we need to recognize that and make sure that we're celebrating all of the diverse populations beyond the weeks or days that they're given on the calendar.
It's interesting you mentioned that, in fact, because when I taught at the New School, we had a student who did cognitive interviewing of people on how they understood survey questions. And when we asked basic "how are you doing" or country or city direction questions, we found that Black people brought a much longer frame of reference to it based on their experience. And I think that's also going to shape their response to corporations as well.
Well, I do want to highlight, Craig, I think we're at the hour. So
yes, we're about out of time. So now I guess it's time for Bridget to come back on. But in the meantime, let me just show one more thing, which is for those who would like to see the report, you can get the report at the link that you're seeing now. I'll put it in the chat, in fact, as well. No, I see it doesn't copy into the chat, but I'll put it in the chat. You'll find the report at AMA.
Awesome. Oh. Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. And thank you to our amazing hosts, Craig and Alan. I loved everything that you guys had to share. And I think all of our viewers did as well. So I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.